Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Financial Wellness, the podcast dedicated to helping physicians in Michigan turn their professional success into financial success while enjoying life along the way. And now, here are your hosts, Andrew Mushbaugh and Trent DeBruin.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Physician's Guide to Financial Wellness. This is Andrew Mushbaugh, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Trent DeBruin. And today we're going to talk about retiring earlier than the traditional retirement age and some of the key areas to understand and things to focus on if you choose to retire in your 50s rather than the more common retirement age of somewhere in your 60s. Which, Trent, I know your kids think you're probably pretty close to retirement age, right?
Yeah, it cracks me up how they can't even wrap their heads around how old 37 is. Can only imagine how ancient they'll think I am when I'm actually in my 50s.
Yeah, you have to appreciate how your kids are always building you up.
Yeah, exactly. I think we could have an entire podcast devoted to some of their one-liners.
All right, we're going to add it to the list. All right, so back to what we'll discuss today, and looking at retiring in your 50s, there are 5 specific areas we'll walk through. Number 1 is looking at one of the biggest drivers of people not retiring in the 50s, which is health insurance prior to Medicare at age 65. Number 2 is around funding your early retirement and what you need to be aware of as you make the transition into the withdrawal phase and creating your own retirement paycheck. Number 3 is how to manage the withdrawal phase and some of the tax considerations to be aware of. Number 4 is creating an investment plan and how to adjust it over time, along with why it's usually different than the traditional retirement path. And the last one, number 5, is asking the question of now what, and some of the other non-financial questions to consider. So Trent, why don't you start us off with one of the most common reasons why people don't retire in their 50s?
Sure, and I guess I should start by saying the most common reason is just that many people can't afford to retire in their 50s.
Yeah, I guess that's one level higher. And I should have rephrased that question of what's one of the most common reasons people can't afford to retire in their 50s.
Yeah, we like to address the obvious parts first. So a big reason why many people can't retire in their 50s, especially earlier in their 50s, is because of health insurance. And more specifically, the cost of paying for private health insurance. And this may be surprising to some people, unless you're self-employed and have had to pay for private health insurance at different points throughout your career. And the reason why it's surprising is that most people don't fully grasp just how expensive private health insurance is. For most employed physicians, you're used to paying a relatively small monthly premium and having pretty comprehensive coverage with reasonable copays, deductibles, and overall out-of-pocket maximum costs. This isn't to say that health insurance during your working years is always quote-unquote cheap, because you can still have all-in costs between your monthly premiums and out-of-pocket costs in the range of $3,000 to $10,000, but compared to paying for private health insurance on your own, it definitely looks cheap. Private health insurance can range between $1,000 to $2,000 or more per month for premiums alone. So thinking about a couple retiring in their 50s, your health insurance coverage could cost $24,000 or more per year just for the premiums. Or said differently, you may be paying $25,000 or more just to have health insurance, not to mention the costs associated with actually using your insurance. In addition to the cost of premiums, you also need to understand the deductible, copays, and out-of-pocket maximums for your coverage, along with your expected usage of your health insurance, to figure out your all-in healthcare costs. As you can imagine, when thinking about these numbers, it's not unreasonable to have a year where you spend $30,000 on healthcare alone, before even factoring in the rest of your living expenses associated with your desired retirement lifestyle. So healthcare prior to Medicare age is a large incremental expense that not everyone's aware of when thinking about their retirement budget. Fortunately, once you turn 65 and become eligible for Medicare, your healthcare costs drop materially. But this is an important item to keep in mind during those years between retirement and Medicare. So thinking about a couple who decides to retire at age 50, they'll need to plan for and factor in potential annual healthcare costs of up to $30,000 in those pre-Medicare years and make sure that cost is supported by their safe investment withdrawals. Like most things, you don't want to focus solely on how expensive private health insurance is and let that deter you from retiring in your 50s if doing so is important to you and you can afford it. As mentioned, this is a temporarily inflated cost, and while it's frustrating how expensive it can be, the important part is understanding the reality of it and having a plan for how to address this expense within the context of the rest of your lifestyle and your overall retirement goals. And as a side note, which I'll avoid going too far into the weeds here, there are certain tax credits available to people who don't have health insurance provided by an employer or by Medicare and who have to buy their own private health insurance. The nice thing is that this tax credit is available to everyone who qualifies, which many physicians or people who are able to retire in their 50s incorrectly assume that they won't qualify because of the size of their net worth or the investments they've accumulated. However, this credit is based on your income as reported for tax purposes, and because of that, you can be strategic about the way you withdraw from your investment accounts in order to manage your taxable income and therefore potentially qualify for it. It might seem hard to believe, but because of this, we've been able to help clients with multi-million-dollar net worths qualify for a tax credit, which, depending on the nature of your situation, could mean annual savings of up to $10,000 or even $15,000 a year.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique situation and unfortunately one of the least understood or utilized planning opportunities, which is hard to believe knowing you can literally save many thousands of dollars per year by being more intentional with your tax planning. And a big part of this intentional planning comes down to how you utilize your income sources and investment accounts in the withdrawal phase of retirement. We'll touch on some of these tax planning considerations in a bit, and we have an entire podcast episode dedicated to tax planning and retirement, episode number 15. But before we do that and dive into some of the specific planning tools, it's helpful to first have an overall understanding of what you need to be aware of around cash flow and your withdrawal plan. In many ways, whether you retire in your 50s, 60s, or 70s, there's a core set of concepts you'll face regardless, which focus on how to create your retirement paycheck. However, there are additional factors that come into play when you retire in your 50s. The first factor is simply around how you will fund your retirement. If you're over the age of 59 and a half, there aren't penalties you have to worry about when withdrawing from your investment accounts, but that's not the case if you retired before 59 and a half. The majority of physicians end up having large 403bs, 401ks, or IRAs from all the years of saving and deferring taxes by contributing to those accounts. This doesn't inherently cause a problem, but if you want to retire at, say, 52 and have $5 million in an IRA and $10,000 in your bank account, you're stuck in a tough spot because every $1 you take out of that IRA before 59 and a half is subject to taxes, but also a 10% early withdrawal penalty. There are certain exceptions, but I'll avoid going too far in the weeds here. And the main takeaway is that you want to be aware of the early withdrawal penalty and avoid it if at all possible, which an easy way to do that is to have a variety of accounts with different tax treatment that you can tap into to fund your retirement. This could be a 457 plan, which isn't subject to early withdrawal penalties, or a brokerage and taxable account. So assuming you are planning to retire in your 50s and want to avoid unnecessary tax penalties, you'll either need to have A, income sources, or B, investment accounts that you can tap into to fund your lifestyle. In looking at your income sources first, the most common one in retirement is Social Security. With Social Security, the earliest you can start collecting your benefits is at age 62. But doing so results in you receiving a reduced monthly benefit, and it isn't usually the best strategy. Alternatively, you could wait until your full retirement age, around the age of 67, where you receive your quote-unquote full benefit. And the last bracket is the point at which you'll receive the maximum eligible benefit, which is delaying collecting on your benefits until age 70. We also have an entire episode number 35, that talks about Social Security and how to think about your ideal claiming strategy based on your situation. So be sure to check that out if you want to deeper dive in this topic. Of course, you could collect at any point between age 62 and 70 with a varying benefit amount for Social Security. And for those retiring in your 60s, this means you only have a couple of years where you are 100% responsible for funding your retirement prior to collecting a monthly Social Security benefit. Whereas retiring in your 50s, similar to the increased expenses for private health insurance, that comes with a prolonged period before the additional income source of Social Security kicks in. And this results in a longer period of time with you needing to fund your retirement from the investments you saved up over time or additional income sources you've created, whether that's part-time work, rental properties, etc. So knowing you have a longer time period where you'll have to fund your retirement paycheck and knowing there are early withdrawal penalties for certain retirement accounts, you'll need to understand what accounts you can tap into during your 50s. This is where it's helpful to have a 457B plan or a 457 plan in general, which has many similar characteristics as a 403B or a 401k plan, but without the early withdrawal penalties. Or have a large enough taxable account, often referred to as an individual brokerage account or a joint brokerage account. Having enough in these accounts allows you to bridge the gap until 59 and a half to at least avoid any unnecessary 10% tax penalties. However, taking it a step further, having a variety of accounts with varying tax treatment allows you to be strategic with how you withdraw from your investment accounts to help minimize your overall lifetime tax bill.
Yeah, and the longer the time period you have in retirement, the more flexibility and control you have in determining what your taxable income will be each year, which can be a blessing knowing that if you're strategic about it, you can save potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of your lifetime. But it can also be overwhelming because of the number of decisions you have to make and the various factors you have to consider and balance when determining the right moves each year and at each phase along the way. So after understanding some of the main considerations that differ when retiring in your 50s as opposed to in your 60s, the next step is understanding how those considerations come into play at a practical level. And the two main factors here are around 1, your withdrawal rate, and 2, tax planning. Your withdrawal rate is simply what percentage you withdraw from your investments each year to fund your retirement lifestyle. Using a simple example, if you have $1 million of investments and you take out $40,000 in a year, your withdrawal rate is 4%. We discussed this in other episodes, but there's something called the 4% rule that's based on research that looks at a traditional 30-year retirement and a typical investment portfolio of 60% stocks and 40% bonds. And the research looked at the time period from the 1920s onward and asked what was the largest withdrawal rate you could have without running out of money during any of those rolling 30-year periods. And that number came out to around 4%. And while this is a good rule of thumb to use for the traditional retirement period of, say, retiring at 60 and either you or your spouse living to age 90, it wasn't designed, or at least tested, looking at a 40-year investment time horizon, which would be the time period more relevant for people retiring in their 50s. With a longer time horizon, there are more variables that are outside of your control, and thus your withdrawal rate becomes more important. That's not to say that if you retired at 58 versus 62, the 4% safe withdrawal rule of thumb is materially different, but it does become increasingly relevant the earlier you retire and the longer that time horizon is. Big picture, the key point here is that when you're in retirement, you want to track the percentage you withdraw from your investments each year to make sure it's safe. And if you retire in your 50s, you may want to consider starting with a lower initial withdrawal rate, perhaps something around 3 or 3.5%, and later increasing it depending on how the early years of retirement play out and what happens with the stock market. That being said, there's no magic universal number here, and the exact approach really will depend on your situation, what your goals are, what adjustments you're willing to make if needed, etc. But the idea with financial planning in general, at least in our opinion, is to strike the balance of enjoying today without jeopardizing anything for your future self. And this becomes more relevant for people retiring in their 50s. It's also worth noting that there are a lot of other nuances and factors that come into play and will impact your withdrawal rate as they change over time. Like when healthcare costs decline with Medicare at age 65, when Social Security income kicks in, your investment returns, etc., which is why you want to revisit it each year. But after you understand your withdrawal rate and feel comfortable with your plan, the next area to consider is your tax plan of how you withdraw from your accounts. For instance, if you only have a traditional or pre-tax 403b and a traditional 457b, you'll have to pay taxes at ordinary income rates on each dollar you withdraw from those accounts. However, most people have some flexibility, whether that's from cash in their bank accounts, money in Roth accounts, or taxable investment accounts they can pull from. In that situation where you have a mix of money in various accounts with varying tax treatment, it's helpful to bucket it out. For example, you may have $1.5 million in a traditional IRA, $500,000 in a traditional 457b, and $1 million in a taxable account. In this example, should you take everything out of your 457b first, take everything out of your taxable account, or should it be some combination of the two? There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but you want to understand what factors are most relevant for you over the next 30 to 40 years of retirement, and then back into a withdrawal plan to minimize the amount of taxes you pay over that entire time period. Like I mentioned earlier, there's potential to save $10,000 to $15,000 a year in health insurance premiums by keeping your taxable income low enough to qualify for a tax credit. In this situation, you might choose to withdraw everything from your taxable investment account in order to capture the tax credit and pay little or no capital gains taxes on the investments you sell in your taxable account. However, this could result in you having a large pre-tax account balance where you could then face a sharp increase in taxes down the road once you deplete your taxable investment account and have to then withdraw everything from your pre-tax accounts and pay taxes on each dollar at ordinary income rates. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but retiring in your 50s results in several additional factors, but also more flexibility and options that you'll want to consider when creating your tax plan.
Exactly. And I wish we could provide a blanket framework to follow to make it easier for people, but unfortunately every situation is different. But I guess that does keep us employed, so maybe we shouldn't hope for that.
Yeah, that's the optimistic view on the hours of tax planning work we get to do.
Well, you and I both know we like doing that.
I know. As dorky as it sounds, we do love that stuff, so fair point.
Exactly. Well, shifting gears from tax planning, the next area that's again relevant for everyone who's in or approaching retirement is your investment allocation. As we've mentioned in several other episodes, the first step in deciding on your investment allocation is looking at your investment time horizon and goals. This is easier to think about with separate goals, like I need a down payment for a house in 5 years, or pay for this expense in 10 years. But when you're looking at retirement, it's harder to grasp for several reasons. One, you have two competing goals of needing to withdraw to fund your annual living expenses, but also need to have enough growth to last throughout your retirement. And two, very similar to the safe withdrawal rate, when you retire in your 50s relative to your 60s, you are now responsible for funding a longer investment period and likely with a higher front-end strain on your investment portfolio due to the time until Social Security kicks in and the temporarily higher expenses related to health insurance. With that in mind, it's important to determine what your investment plan will be in retirement along with when you'll make changes. Funding a 40-year retirement versus a 30-year retirement means there is an additional 10 years of rising living costs from inflation that you have to factor in. This means the amount of growth needed to sustain your portfolio is going to be higher than if you retired 10 years earlier. We won't dive too far into the weeds here with the various strategies you can use to create the right investment mix for you, because similar to creating a tax plan, it's going to be unique based on each person on when they retire, their living expenses, investment portfolio size, withdrawal rate, income sources, and investment temperament, amongst several other factors. Instead, we like to break down this gray area into more manageable framework for how to think about finding the right mix. To do this, we find it helpful to break down retirement into a few periods. 1, retirement until age 65, when eligible for Medicare. 2, retirement from 65 until you start collecting Social Security. And 3, the time you collect Social Security until 90 years, 10 days, and 5 minutes.
Is that your prediction for me or you?
I'll let you know when we get closer.
All right, very reassuring.
Glad to hear it. But looking at those 3 retirement phases as a starting point allows you to see how the amount you withdraw from your investment portfolio changes over time, as expenses decrease at 65, as income comes in from Social Security, and then with the third phase potentially being between those two. By backing into how much you estimate you'll need from your portfolio each year, you can then look at the cushion or buffer you'll need to have in more safe and stable investments to pull from to fund your retirement during the inevitable periods when the stock portion of your investment portfolio is down. A general rule of thumb we like to target is having anywhere from 5 to 7 years of living expenses in safer or more stable investments like bonds, and we call this your war chest. There's no magic to this rule of thumb, but the idea is to have a runway or cushion of money that you can live off of to allow the growth portion, your stocks, enough time to recover and eventually grow to keep up with your living expenses, which increase over time as the cost of everything rises due to inflation. With retirement in your 50s and knowing you'll have a longer investment horizon, you may decide to have a shorter runway of 5 to 6 years in your early 50s and then gradually shift towards 6 to 7 years as you get into your 60s. This will differ based on how your investment returns actually play out, but breaking down your retirement into several different periods can give you more concrete information to help you back into the right investment mix for you.
Exactly. And I'm glad you didn't say the magic investment allocation was 64.2% stocks and 35.8% bonds.
I debated it.
And so the last area we'll touch on has nothing at all to do with finances, and it's instead around the idea of what now or what's next. We'll discuss this just briefly since everyone has their own unique situation, career path, family dynamic, and preferences, but it's relevant no matter what the situation. And we've mentioned this many times throughout our retirement-related podcasts, but when it comes to retirement, we prefer to focus on the idea of financial independence as opposed to retirement. With financial independence, you have the financial ability to stop working and quote-unquote retire, but you might still choose to continue working, scale back, or shift gears to another role. On the other hand, retirement is the actual event of stopping work. So while you have to be financially independent to retire, you don't have to retire just because you're financially independent. You've no doubt seen peers, friends, neighbors, or parents who have retired and loved every minute of it from the beginning, but probably also people who have retired and had a tough time with the transition and the new normal as they no longer have work as an anchor and as a source of purpose, structure, socialization, and even self-worth in their lives. With that in mind, before making the transition, we always encourage people to proactively think about what's next or how they'll fill up their days in retirement. It can be helpful to literally go through a day-to-day or a month-to-month scenario of how you'll fill your time. Volunteering, spending time with children or grandchildren, picking up a new hobby, traveling, golfing, reading, etc. The list is clearly endless. This isn't meant to take away from the enjoyment of that first year of freedom in retirement, of getting to do nothing and simply appreciating the newfound time and flexibility, but rather considering the next several decades and having a fulfilling life of purpose during that time. This looks different for everyone, and some people might be perfectly content golfing every day and sitting by the beach, but that stereotypical retirement image isn't for everyone, and before you retire, especially if you retire in your 50s, you want to have a plan for what you're retiring to.
Yeah, it's such a good point of what you're retiring to. And it's really fun for us getting to see people make this retirement transition because we get to live vicariously through them and see all the different ways people make it work.
It really is. And especially how many different ways you can do it the quote unquote right way.
Yeah, exactly. And well, hopefully that was helpful for anyone thinking about or entering into retirement in their 50s. And just to give a quick recap of what we discussed today, number 1 is to understand and have a plan for private health insurance prior to age 65, given that this can cost up to $30,000 per year. Number 2 is to be aware of the factors to consider when funding your retirement, the time period until you start collecting Social Security, tax penalties for withdrawing from certain retirement accounts before age 59.5, and the importance of having varying investment accounts with different tax treatment. Number 3, you want to ensure you have a safe withdrawal rate and are aware of how an early retirement can impact what that is. From there, and based on your unique situation, you should have a 30 to 40-year tax plan and then back into what you should do each year based on minimizing your lifetime tax bill, which earlier on includes areas like your health insurance tax credit and the order in which you withdraw from your investment accounts. And number 4 is looking at your investment allocation and what to think about when deciding on the right mix for you, along with how it changes over time. To do this, it's helpful to break down your retirement into a couple phases based on the time until 65 when Medicare starts, and then from the time you start collecting Social Security. And lastly, number 5 is to ask the question of now what or what next, to make sure that you're excited about the next phase beyond just the next year. This is where it's helpful to understand the difference between financial independence and retirement. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for another episode of the show. You can find the show notes at the podcast page of our website, mdwmllc.com/podcast. And if you have thoughts to share or questions you'd like to have answered, please feel free to shoot us an email at info@mdwmllc.com. Take care, everyone, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Want even more ideas, tools, and resources on how to make smart financial decisions? Check out the resources section of MD Wealth Management's website at mdwmllc.com, where you'll find additional knowledge and insight from Michigan physicians, including a blog, ebook, and one-page guides. While there, you can also schedule a 15-minute conversation with Andrew and Trent to learn more about what it means to work with the firm and how they serve physicians. If you've enjoyed the content, please leave a review on iTunes and share with your friends and colleagues. Thanks so much for listening. Andrew Mushbaugh and Trent DeBruin are certified financial planners, principals, and co-founders of MD Wealth Management, a registered investment advisory firm in the state of Michigan. All opinions shared in the show are for general information and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future returns. Please consult with your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before making any decisions.